get through into 21 today. Numbers 17 through 21. And let's start with prayer. God, we come before you and we wait to hear from your word and to see how you interacted with people or how we should interact with you. And would you help us to take your word seriously and take it to heart, to not ignore any part of it that doesn't fit us or suit us, but to submit to it and to live by it. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. It's been a few Sundays, I think, now since I've taught, since we've been in the book of Numbers. And I think we've been studying some of these stories in the book of Numbers, and I think I could sum up the stories in Numbers with one word. And if I were to sum it up in one word, I would sum up the stories of Numbers with the word drama. There's a lot of drama, and I don't mean drama like in a theater. I mean drama like in a public high school. You know, that's kind of what it feels like. People are bickering, they're fighting for popularity, they're fighting for prominence. People are vying with Moses and Aaron for their positions of leadership, like kids vie for the captain of the football team or something like that, you know. People are grumbling over the food, just like kids grumble over the food in the cafeteria. The nation is even in a few chapters from now, they're gonna fall into a raucous party and into sexual immorality, and it's been absolute chaos in the desert. And God's patience has worn very, very thin. It's been pushed to the very limit. And you know, sometimes we talk about church drama. Have you ever heard that term before? It's a terrible term, by the way. Church politics, don't like that much either. But just like in the book of Numbers, when there's such thing as church drama or church politics, it boils down to the same thing, which is a lack of trust in God and an overabundance of pride in yourself and in your own opinions. And I think of James 3. Right now I can't pull it up out of my memory, so I'm look it up real quick. James 3, he says, if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, which is what the people in Numbers did, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but it's earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, and we see that a ton in the book of Numbers, where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and every evil practice. And that's what we will see over and over again throughout these stories. I've been studying the book of Proverbs in my own, just for myself lately, and one of the things I've found is that you can learn just as much from the example of fools as you can from the example of those who are wise. And so, as we read the book of Numbers, let's learn what not to do in our church, okay, and what not to do in our families by studying this selfish, childish drama in the book of Numbers. And let's learn from Moses, too. He's the most humble man in all the earth, a good example, but even he fell at times, which we'll see today. So let's kind of do a review, since it's been a while since we've talked about Numbers, what we've learned so far. So do you remember? Does anybody remember why? And we won't do a mic here, but just shout it out if you remember why. Why is it called Numbers? Good. There was a census. There's a census at the beginning of the book, and there's a census toward the end of the book. And that's why it's called Numbers. And these censuses are there to show that the whole generation that came out of Egypt, across the Red Sea, that they were destroyed because of their rebellion in the wilderness. But that God raised up a whole new generation, second census, which is almost as much as the first, to enter the promised land and receive the promises. So in the first 10 chapters of Numbers, Israel is sitting there in front of Mount Sinai, and they're waiting to receive travel instructions from God. They learn how the camp is supposed to be organized. Do you remember this? And arranged. There's a whole who goes where around the tabernacle. God gave different roles to the different types of Levites for packing up and setting up the tabernacle when they moved from place to place. He gave rules about maintaining purity and cleanliness as they moved along. We learned about people called Nazarites, which were people who weren't Levites, but they had decided to especially devote themselves to the Lord in holiness. Then Israel set out in their travels in chapter 11, and that's when everything falls apart. That's when a lot of the stories start. And they are traveling for 3 days, and the rabble among them start to complain about only having this manna, and they want meat. Remember that? Then, in chapter 12, Moses' own siblings, Miriam and Aaron, complain against him, speak against Moses, try to take this position of leadership. In chapter 13, spies went out into the land, and they came back, and they reported that the land was good, but there were giants there, and they scared all the people. The people were discouraged. They rebelled in chapter 14 against Moses. They talked about stoning him and choosing a new leader, and God responded with a very severe punishment. Do you remember what it was? That whole generation that came out of Egypt was going to die in the wilderness. They would not enter the promised land. They would be sitting there for 40 years until the last of their bodies died in the wilderness. In chapter 16, the grumbling continues, and this is the last thing we studied. Korah and a couple of other Reubenites challenged Aaron for the priesthood. And they said, all of us are holy. What makes him any more special than us? Why does he get to be the high priest? And God said, step away from their tents. And the earth swallowed them up, at least the 2 Reubenites and their children. And it's been, like I said, absolute chaos and drama, and people vying with each other, envy and selfish ambition. Now in chapter 17, that's where we're going to be today, God tries to put an end to all this. And so look at chapter 17, verses 1 through 4. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and get 12 staffs from them, one from the leader of each of their ancestral tribes. Write the name of each man on his staff. On the staff of Levi, write Aaron's name, for there must be one staff for the head of each ancestral tribe. Put them in the tent of meeting in front of the ark of the covenant where I meet with you. The staff belonging to the man I choose will sprout, and I will rid myself of this constant grumbling against you by the Israelites. Do you know what the meanest backyard bird is? Blue jay, I think. They can be really mean to other birds. And I read this story about someone saw a woodpecker who was just, vigorously working on the base of this ponderosa pine tree. And a blue jay came and arrogantly just chased the woodpecker away. And then the blue jay started pecking in that same spot to try to get whatever worm or whatever bug they were looking for. And pretty soon, because the blue jay just lacked the right equipment, it gave up and it flew away. And they drew a lesson from that, which is this: don't criticize others and try to shove them aside when they may be doing better than you could. And that's what kept happening in the book of Numbers. Aaron had this job to be God's priest, and people kept thinking, why does he get to do this? Why does he get to do this? His work was for the benefit of the people, and yet they kept, like blue jays, they were flocking to push aside God's chosen leaders, Moses and Aaron. And so God needs to make this very clear that he chose them. He said, I'm going to rid myself of this constant grumbling. And so he tells them, collect all the staffs of each tribal leader. So there's going to be 12 staffs for the 12 tribes. And in Hebrew, the word staff and the word tribe are the same word, mate. The staff represented authority. And so each leader would write their name on their staff, and Aaron's name would go on Levi's, like I read. And Moses was going to take these 12 staffs, and he was going to bring them right into the most holy place of the tabernacle and put them there in front of the ark. And that's a symbolic way of testing which one of these tribes and their tribal leader has the authority to do priestly work in the tabernacle of God. So remember, Aaron's staff, do you remember what Aaron did with his staff? He did a miracle with it. It turned into the snake, right? In Exodus 7, that at least is one miracle that he did with it. But he's had it for a while. They put these staffs down. It's just this piece of dead wood. It's a walking staff. And the next day, Aaron's staff budded flowers. It blossomed. It produced almonds. That's quite a miracle. Like this was not a living tree anymore. And it happened all overnight. And it seems significant that it not only blossomed, but it blossomed almonds. Because the word almond sounds like almost exactly like the word for watching. And in Hebrew. And Jeremiah had a vision in chapter 1 where he saw an almond tree. And God's response to the vision was that he's been watching to see that his word would be fulfilled. And so here God is watching to see that Aaron's line continues and is blessed. And no one can force any other tribe or person into that line. Aaron's staff buds, and the author of Hebrews tells us that his budded staff got placed within the ark and was one of the things that was in the Ark of the Covenant. And people, when they see Aaron's staff budding in Numbers 17, they have a really interesting response. The Israelites said to Moses, "We will die. We're all lost. We are all lost. Anyone who ever comes near the tabernacle of the Lord will die. We're all going to die." Talk about drama for one thing, but man, they just go crazy. And rather than accepting God's choice with humility, they just fall into despair. And that was not the point of the miracle. They were too prideful to accept it. They didn't realize that Aaron had his position of authority to bless them, to do good for them. Now, the Aaronic priesthood, the priesthood line that came from Aaron, is very important in Old Testament and New Testament theology. And I think it's important for us to kind of understand how it worked. So throughout the Old Testament, Aaron's priesthood continues as God had promised. First with Eleazar. That was Aaron's third-born son. Remember that Aaron had two sons who died in Leviticus 10 because they offered what was called strange fire. Eleazar became the next high priest in his dad's place. Aaron had one more son named Ithamar, too, who also did priestly work, but he didn't become the high priest. In the line of Aaron's line, he has Eleazar, and Eleazar's son's name is Phinehas, which is what I named my firstborn son. And you can find that line in 1 Chronicles 6. There's the line of Aaron's family. The next time this line pops up with any significance is in 1 Samuel. So in 1 Samuel, Eli is in the line of Aaron's priesthood. Remember old Eli? And Eli had two sons named Hophni and Phinehas. So there's two Phinehas's in the priesthood. Eli did not come from Eleazar's line. He came from Ithamar's line, the fourth son of Aaron. I don't know why, we don't know why, the high priesthood kind of transferred over to his line. And Eli's sons, you remember, those two were rascals. They stood outside of the tent. They slept with the women that worked outside of the tabernacle. They took meat that they shouldn't have from sacrifices that were meant for God. And so they were terrible people. And so I will often tell Phinehas that, my son, Finn, you're named after Phinehas in the Bible, but you get to choose which one. You can be the good Phinehas, Aaron's grandson, and he was a hero of the faith. Or you can be the bad Phinehas, right? This guy. And so Eli receives a message from a man of God, and from Samuel himself, actually, as well, telling him that your line, that the priests in your line, none of them will die, or all of them will die in the prime of their life. They're going to die early. Fast forward a couple generations from that. David is running away from Saul. You remember this? And he goes into the tabernacle. And the priest that was serving there in the tabernacle is named Ahimelech, who is probably the great-grandson of Eli. Ahimelech helps David on his journey, but he's killed in the prime of life, right, by Saul. Saul ordered someone to kill him, and all the priests at that place. And only Ahimelech's son Abiathar escaped, and he came to David, and he became David's personal priest. And David eventually had two priests. One was Abiathar from the line of Ithamar, and the other was Zadok. Zadok was also in the line of Aaron, but he came from Aaron's third-born son, Eleazar. He came from that line. They became co-priests during David's reign. And Abiathar eventually sided with the wrong son of David to become the king. I hope I haven't lost you too much here. I wish I had some sort of graphic, but I don't. He sided with Adonijah instead of with Solomon to be king. Zadok sided with Solomon. And so Zadok became the priest, and his line continued. And the reason why I mention this is because Zadok became known as the true priest of God in Jewish history. And this became a very serious thing. The high priesthood had to come from Zadok's line. And throughout the Second Temple period, after the Old Testament was completed and before the New Testament was written, the high priesthood got sold to whoever could pay the most money. It was a terrible thing. Jews who were serious about God, this was the thing that made them so upset, right? And have you ever heard of Essenes? There's Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. Essenes was another sect. And what really separated them was they thought that the high priest should be from the line of Zadok, and they could not accept the high priesthood of the Sadducees, who had it during Jesus' time. And so they lived out in the desert. John the Baptist might have been an Essene. They lived in a community called Qumran, which is where we got our Dead Sea Scrolls. And one of their main things that they kept writing about was the high priesthood. They believed that not only would there be a Messiah from the line of David, a messianic king, they believed that there would be a Messiah from the line of Levi, from Aaron's line, from Zadok's, a priestly Messiah who would come, and that the two Messiahs would rule Israel together. And there's reason for saying that in the Old Testament too. For instance, if you read the book of Zechariah, you kind of see that. But so they lived out in the wilderness. They thought these things. And what's beautiful is that the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, it brings all this to bear about the Aaronic priesthood and about all these things. And the author of Hebrews, aware of all this history and theology surrounding the high priesthood, he took great pains to prove that Jesus is not only the Messiah from David, but he is the legitimate high priest, that both Messiahs, if there are two, are fulfilled in one person, which is Jesus. And our Lord Jesus is both priest and king, as well as the great prophet of God. And the Levites, they had an important role, but it was just a placeholder. It's just a foreshadowing of the coming Lord and his priestly work, which was accomplished on the cross. So that was quite a rabbit trail, but I wanted you to understand that because this passage and all these fights about who has the priesthood and all these things, it's going somewhere. It matters to understanding the Old Testament and the New Testament as well. Are there any questions about that? Yes, Maureen, there's a microphone.
I'm wondering if Melchizedek was an Essene?
Good question. So Melchizedek was long before Essenes existed. Melchizedek is all the way back from Genesis 14, during the time of Abraham. Melchizedek was both a king and a priest, which is why he took that and he said, Jesus is a priest in the line of Melchizedek. The author of Hebrews says that. Chapter 7. He lived in Jerusalem. It was called Salem at the time. And Abraham paid him a tithe, like you would pay a Levite a tithe, you know. And so he was the king, and his big anchor for why he could say that Jesus was from the line of Melchizedek was that there's this strange psalm. And of all the psalms in the New Testament, it's the one that's the most quoted. Psalm 110. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I place your enemies under your feet. Excuse me for not getting this perfect. I make you a priest in the line of Melchizedek, is what it says. It's so interesting. It's strange that it's a psalm, and yet he draws that and says that's about Jesus, and that's pretty cool. Yeah. Okay. If there are no other questions, we will move on to chapter 18. Okay. Chapter 18 of Numbers. One of the things that's interesting about Numbers is it doesn't flow super, you're talking about one thing, and then the next thing there's a different chapter about something totally different. And this is about Levites again, so that's not totally different, but it's about how they got paid, basically, about their giving tithes to the Lord and how they went to the Levites. So the Levites were the tribe, and remember, they weren't all priests, but they all had the work of serving in the tabernacle or the temple, and part of them were priests, Aaron's line. And they were not given personal inheritance of property like in the promised land, like all the other tribes were. They were given a different inheritance. Their inheritance were the tithes of the other Israelites. And so this was seen as a reward, as a payment for their holy work in the tabernacle or in the temple. And they were to provide for the household of the Lord rather than being all about their own household, their own property and farms. And so all the other Israelites needed to give a tenth of their produce that they grew each year to the temple. And from that was distributed it all to the Levites. Levites were given towns to live in, by the way, but they just didn't have their own tribal portion of land with which to support themselves. So the priests in Aaron's line, that section of the Levites, they didn't actually receive any of the tithe. They received the offerings and the sacrifices, which were different from the tithes. So people would bring a sin offering or something like that. That food would go to the priests in Aaron's line. But they did receive a tithe from the Levites. The Levites received a tithe from the people, and then the Levites tithed to Aaron's priestly line. And in Numbers 18, it tells us that the priests, Aaron's line, received different things for payment for their work in the tabernacle. They received portions of the most holy sacrifices, portions of sacred gifts and well-being offerings, the first fruits offerings of oil, new wine, and grain. That was not part of the yearly tithe. Things that were devoted to the Lord as part of a vow, the meat of firstborn animals, and then the tithes of the Levites. Now, actually, the other tribes, besides the Levites, sort of gave 3 tithes. So they gave 10% to the Levites every year. They were also instructed in Deuteronomy 14 to bring a tithe of their produce, in addition to that other tithe, a tithe of their produce to the temple and eat it themselves. So they didn't give it to the Levites. They came and they ate at the tabernacle as a celebration with another tenth. And then finally, every third year, they were to give a tenth to the sanctuary so that the Levites, foreigners, fatherless, and widows could be provided for. So every 3 years. So about 23.33% of their agricultural output went to others. Now, the idea of the tithe has stuck, obviously, with Christians. And now 10% is kind of a handy number that's given to the church, 10% of your income tithe on that. But tithing is actually never commanded in the New Testament for Christians. Did you know that? Paul tells the Corinthians to set aside a portion of their money each week, but there's no number or percentage that's given to us. And I think it's clear that every believer should be giving something out of their income to God. But the only verse that we have on how much to go on is 2 Corinthians 9:7, where Paul says, "Each of you should give whatever you've decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver." This takes away the legalism of, I've got to give this certain amount to a church to be a part of it. It takes away the legalism, but it opens up the opportunity to give as much as the Lord has enabled us to give. And we should each listen to God, what he's telling us to give. And when we do that, God's going to be more pleased than a strict, I got to give this percentage of money to be right with God, right? We listen to our hearts and what God's telling us. And we should also remember what I mentioned in this last sermon and sermon before, that we share with each other all that we have, right? So in other ways, the tithes in the Old Testament are similar to what the church puts its money towards. So the tithes supported the priests and the Levites who did the work of the Lord, and that was actually their main use. So it was to support the priests, the Levites. In the same way, the church offerings here supports the staff, and a lot of our church budget goes to supporting me and the other pastors and the staff. And I really think our admin board was wise. They decided to pay each person on staff what the average person in their position in a church this size would get paid in this area. So they just tried to say, you know, what do other churches pay? And we have that information. Let's choose the average. And that way we're not overpaid, we're not underpaid. But, you know, this church has been generous to me and my family at least, and my parents before me, just above and beyond in ways that make us feel really loved and supported and secure in our positions. But the Old Testament tithes, they also went to helping the poor. And I think that's something that we've done well at Lockwood and something we're doing even more now. We have the Benevolent Fund, which is to help the needy in our congregation. And now with this Kingdom Investment team, we're reaching out to the community to help those who have needs, and I think that's really good. Also, the funds were collected, not part of the tithe, but every once in a while funds would be collected to fix the temple, to just do repairs and things like that. And our funds that we bring in go to keep the lights on and repair things around the church. And one thing that's not really in the Old Testament budget, but I'm glad that we do it, is they didn't give anything to missions because Jews were not mission-minded, right? That was the opposite of what they were about. But we are, because God told us to be, and we give about 20% of our budget each year to missions, which is amazing. So thinking about things this way, I think Lockwood's doing really well, and we've always been a giving church. God's blessed us because of it, I think, and he's worked through us to help many people, and so it's been good. Any questions about that? Comments? Mike?
Just backing up a little bit, a comment about the Levites and their portion. Weren't they also given the pasture lands around the city?
Yeah, I think they were.
Yeah, I think that to keep all those animals that were for sacrifices and what have you.
Right, they had animals and things like that as well. Yeah, but they weren't given like a section of land. Yeah. Yep. Good, thank you. Yes, Dan.
Yeah, I've seen in the past with churches that got stingy with their mission budget. I've seen them churches fail. When they were generous, the churches thrived.
Yeah.
I've seen that about 3 different times. So.
Yeah, there's always that fear that if you give more, if you're more outputting with your money as a church, you're not going to have enough for yourself. And it always works the opposite way. When you're looking to be as generous as you can as a church, I feel like you always have enough. God just provides more. But when you start getting afraid, you got to hold back for yourself, then you start to lose money somehow. You start to not have enough when that's what you're trying to do. And so we don't want to be that as a church. We want to always be looking for how the Lord wants us to give as individuals and as a body. Yeah, thank you. All right, we're going to move on to chapter 19, which is a weird chapter, to be honest. It's something about a certain kind of ceremonial cleansing. And so before I get into that, let me again read Hebrews. You know, knowing Hebrews, understanding it, is so helpful for approaching Genesis through Deuteronomy, those first 5 books of the Bible. It really opens it up. It helps you to see it in terms of Christ and what he's done and how he's fulfilled those books, and vice versa too. To know the first 5 books of the Bible really helps you to get Hebrews and say, wow, what an incredible book. But this is from Hebrews chapter 9, verses 13 through 14. He says this, the blood of goats, I think he's talking about the Day of Atonement, and bulls, I think he's talking about the covenant sacrifice that was made to establish the old covenant, and the ashes of a heifer, that's Numbers 19 where we're at, the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean, sanctify them so that they're outwardly clean. Okay, you get it? So it doesn't do anything on the inside. It makes your outside outwardly clean so that you can approach God and his tabernacle. How much more then, he says, will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God? Jesus' blood cleanses on the inside, makes us not only outwardly clean the inside of the dish, and the outside will be clean too, right? So he cleanses us. His sacrifice cleanses us on the inside. In Numbers 19, God is making a provision to help people who have become ceremonially unclean by being in the presence of a dead body or touching a human bone or something like that. When you came in contact with death in any way, you became ceremonially unclean. And so what was to be done? Well, a spotless red heifer. I don't know why it had to be red, but it did. A spotless red heifer was to be chosen and slaughtered and completely burned, just to ashes. And its ashes which would include its burnt blood as well, would be kept aside in some sort of container. And so whenever someone became unclean by being around a dead body, a clean person, would take some of those ashes from the heifer and put it in running water. And he would give that water and sprinkle it on the person who had become unclean and on his tent and all the vessels in it. And then that was called the water of cleansing. The author of Hebrews is taking these ashes of a heifer and he's applying it to Christ. This was when you came in contact with a dead body, you were outwardly unclean. He's saying we have come in contact with acts that lead to death on the inside. Sin puts us to death on the inside. But Jesus' blood purifies us, kind of like the ashes of a heifer, but inwardly. Cleanses our consciences so that we can serve God. It's interesting that he even takes this random passage that today we'd be like, I don't know what to do with this. I'm probably not going to burn a heifer alive nor find a red one and, all this stuff. But here he shows us that this even applies to Christ too. Yes, Jim?
A few years ago, I read how the Jews are preparing to build the temple again, which is in Revelation. Okay, that it will be there. And one of the things they were doing was breeding cattle, red heifers, not to have one white hair on them. And so it had to be solid red, not one white hair. And they're actively doing that so that when they rebuild this temple, that they'll have those ashes.
That's what you have to do when you don't have Christ. You got to find a red heifer with no white hair. Am I right? We don't have to do that. We have Jesus, and thank God for that. Yes, Maureen.
I just think the red is symbolic of the blood of Christ.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, it's a good thought. They probably didn't know that back then, and we can look back and say, "Wow." All right, let's turn to chapter 20. Chapter 20 is a sad chapter. It's a very sad chapter because at the beginning of it, the Israelites, God moves them out of Kadesh Barnea, where they'd been for 38 years. There's a spring there, and it's an oasis, there's plenty of water. He moves them. The first place they stop, there's no water. Miriam, the sister of Moses, dies at the beginning of the chapter. Aaron, towards the end of the chapter, dies and is buried on Mount Hor. And Moses, in the middle of the chapter, sins, and he can no longer go into the promised land. It's a sad chapter. It's a difficult one. And so let's kind of get into it. They get to this place, and this lack of water causes them to quarrel. Now, if you didn't have water or anything to drink for 3 days, do you think you would be quarreling with your family? Probably, right? Let's just be honest. Even if we didn't have food for lunch, we might be a little grumpy, right? So they're quarreling with Moses and Aaron again, and just like they did in Exodus 17 when they had no water, and God brought water out of the rock to drink, it's happening again. And that happened when they were young, and now it's happening when they're old, and they're doing the same thing. They're saying, we want to go back to Egypt. Why'd you bring us out here to die of thirst? And they're all upset. And again, God tells Moses to perform the same kind of miracle that he did back then. There's a rock here. I want you to bring water out of it, just like you did in Exodus 17. And in Exodus, God told Moses, strike the rock, and water will come out of it. Here in Numbers 20, he tells him, take your staff, but speak to the rock, and in the presence of Israelites, and it will pour out water. You ever tried speaking to a rock and telling it to do something? Well, let's read this out loud. This is Numbers chapter 20, verses 9 through 13. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him, and he and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, listen, you rebels, must we bring water out of this rock? Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. These waters were called Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled with the Lord and where he was proved holy among them. So that's quite a punishment. I mean, so Moses has led the Israelites for 80 years. There's a few people who have been alive for 80 years, right? That's a long time. He's led them. I mean, he was 40 when he started, and he's led them for 80 years. He's been faithful through thick and thin. He's been the most humble man in all the earth. And in Moses, he struck the rock instead of speaking to it. And now he has to miss out on the thing that he had been hoping for his entire life, which was to enter the promised land. Thing he'd been working for through his entire life, thing he'd been waiting for. This is the same punishment that the rebels of Numbers 14 faced. And Moses now is a part of it, right? It's sad. And what did Moses do that was so bad? Well, God tells him, because you didn't trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites. He didn't trust God. And this was a matter of faith, and he's taking honor that belonged to God. Did you notice when Moses did it, he said, must we bring water out of this rock for you? If he had just spoken, it would have been clear that it wasn't him who was knocked hard enough on the rock to make it. It just all came from God, right? He was a prophet. His words counted for God's. It would have showed God did this. But he says, must we do it? And he gave God no credit, took all the credit for himself, something very odd for Moses to do. I think he was probably thirsty, right? God doesn't excuse us when we have problems, like we're thirsty or hungry, and we still sin. You know, that doesn't make the sin any better. And then God said to speak to the rock, but did you notice he struck it twice? He didn't even just strike it once. He struck it twice, and water came out. And to strike the rock, the Hebrew says that Moses lifted up his hand. And that's the same language that's used in 1530 of sinning against God with a high hand, which means intentional, rebellious, blasphemous type of sin. And that's how God took it. And there's no sacrifice for that kind of sin. And part of the greatness of Moses' sin was that he was Israel's leader and their example. And if he could rebel against God in such a way, in the presence of the whole community, God needed to make an example out of him. And I want to read to you quickly how Moses himself kind of summarizes this sin and its result. This is Deuteronomy chapter 3. 23 through 29. He says this. At that time I pleaded with the Lord, Sovereign Lord, you have begun to show your servant your greatness and your strong hand. For what God is there in heaven that could do the mighty works? I'm sorry, having trouble reading my own Bible. You do. Let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, that fine hill country in Lebanon. But because of you, the Lord was angry with me and would not listen to me. That's enough, the Lord said. Do not speak to me anymore about this matter. And then he tells him to choose Joshua and commission him, and that he's going to go up on a hill and die and be able to see the promised land but not enter it. Yes.
In our own personal walk with the Lord, and we know God has spoken to us in some way, if we have a habit of doing something this way, and God worked it out this way, and now God tells us to do it that way instead of this way, that is a challenge to our nature to follow God or follow our habits there. We have kind of a picture of that in this story here. The beautiful thing is God is not bound by doing something the same way every time. He has full freedom, and we have to give that freedom to the Lord, because if we try to do God's will our way, we generally end in trouble. But if we can learn that God has a will and He has a way, and it's not always the same thing in dealing with situations on this earth, but coming to the point where we can just surrender and do it as God says at that time, it always works out.
Right. It must have been a little confusing for Moses. I struck the rock the first time. That worked. I'll do it again. And actually it worked. Water came out, right? But that didn't mean that he didn't sin against God. So, and at the end of chapter 20 and into 21, things get even more gloomy. Israel sends messages to the king of Edom asking for safe passage. The king of Edom says, no, you can't come here. They ask again. Moses even addresses the letter, this is what your brother Israel says, because Edom came from Esau, Jacob's brother. But Edom sends out an army, chases them away. Aaron dies. Some Canaanites on the southern border of the Promised Land came and attacked them, prisoners of war. And next week we're going to pick up on this journey that they've started to take. We're going to find that they get bitten by poisonous snakes. Remember that the bronze snake? We'll talk about that. And there's a new issue of a wicked prophet named Balaam who comes and tries to curse them. And what we'll find is that despite all these struggles and all these difficulties Israel had, despite their sins and rebelliousness, God's always faithful. He ends up turning their defeats all into victories, which we'll see some of those next week too. And he did this because he chose them as his people. He's going to be faithful, and he does the same for us. If we belong to Christ, even though we have many snakes along the path, so to speak, even though we have a lot of defeats, we will have ultimate victory, and because he's faithful. So thank you for coming.